Hello, beautiful people. That is a clip that Skeptical Waves was kind enough to produce for me, just to pull down for me, download and throw my way so that I could have some kind of an introduction. It doesn't have the most updated list of channel supporters, the Praetorian Chads who make this possible, for whom I am eternally grateful. And also, it seemed to play a bit slow. And he also picked a version of it where I was clearing my throat in the middle of it. So, yeah, we're experiencing minor wardrobe malfunctions here, but thank you all for joining us. Please do follow this channel, Semiagog, as well as a safer space. You can do that on a BitChute on YouTube. You can do it on Odyssey. I hope you will. There's also Telegram, Twitter, and Gab. For those who wish to support the channel, there is GoFundMe and there is Subscribestar. I see a few moderators in the house like Zed Des. Thank you all for being here. Thanks very much for keeping an eye on things. And again, thanks to everyone who is here, including Praise of Folly, who has joined me for the first time on this channel. He does his own geopolitical and great game analysis. So I'm very happy to have him here. We're going to bounce around some ideas about what might be going on in terms of further moves that Russia might be making in Europe outside of Ukraine. In the course of looking at this, we're going to check out some maps. We're going to consider the history. I hope to take a careful look at some rivers like the Dniester and in particular the Danube, which once upon a time a mustache man, where is that quote? A mustache man, it is reported, allegedly, because this is from a table talk book, which, you know, I can neither, that I cannot confirm or whatever, but he said, allegedly, the Danube is the waterway which leads into the very heart of the continent. And for this reason, in a Europe united by us, will have to be regarded as a German river and controlled by Germany. Interesting little historical tidbit there, given where the Danube runs, the countries that it touches, and its importance, which we will take a look at here. So yeah, we're gonna in the course of this also probably certainly talk about Ukraine and the major players that are coming together here to cause these things to happen, or at least not doing anything to stop them from happening. Though I suspect the actual situation we're facing involves a good deal more cunning. So I'm going to run through some things here once Praise of Folly comes in, but I want to give him an opportunity to introduce himself. Please, sir, maybe say something about your channel. I hope everyone will go and check it out and consider subscribing, but let people know who you are and what you're up to.
Yeah, well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to appear on your channel, Semiagog. I run the channel Price of Folly podcast, where I talk about, among other things, history, current events, geopolitics, political science, all sorts of stuff. I've had in the past debates and interviews. Check them out. You can follow and support me at my locals account, praiseoffolly.locals.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at POF Podcast. And you can also subscribe to my YouTube channel just by typing in Praise of Folly Podcast in the YouTube search channel, and you'll see it.
Excellent. Sorry for the pause there. I'm just trying to figure out what I need to do to share my screen and get this all set up. As I said before, I hope everyone will go over and check out Praise of Folly's channel. Because everybody here needs support. We all get throttled by the YouTube algorithm. So one of the only ways that any of our channels can continue to grow is by getting called out by our friends and fellow content creators. So yeah, let me see, folks, if I can quickly get this map to show up. I'm sorry, I'm still on my old computer, which is why I don't have my proper opening clip. And I'm dealing with some things that are a bit different on this older version. Let me see if I can make this appear. There we are. This hopefully will work. Yes. Let's see if this comes up on screen. Okay, so there are just a few things that I want to take a look at here as sort of setting the stage for everything that we're going to be thinking about here, because all of this did not appear ab nihilo, out of nothing last week. You know, the nature of the great game is such that there's always a backstory. There's always elements that have been sort of winding forward through time that bring us to the point where we are today. So just to review some of that, I want to take a look at some of the changes that have been going on, um, and perhaps to give us a better context for everything that's going on today. So we can see here the Russian Empire. This is as of 1914, roughly. Now, if we've got some serious World War I mentats in here, you might spot something that is inaccurate about the map, but in terms of its general picture, I think it's reliable. And the important thing that I want everyone to see here is that the Russian Empire, once upon a time, extended much further out into Europe than it does today. You can see that it covered most of what is today Poland. It pushed over into areas that are Germany today, or at least bordered on them. Much of Romania was swallowed up by Russia at that point, what is today Romania. Although they got territory doubtless from the Austro-Hungarian Empire as well. But you should look here also at how Finland and the Baltics are not part of this picture in the sense of being outside of Russian control or blocking the Gulf there, or bay, that runs up to St. Petersburg, with Tallinn in Estonia on one side, Helsinki on the other. And you can also see that they pushed down far enough south, and I think that this is quite important, that they controlled much of the Dniester River, and they also controlled the delta of the Danube, which, I mentioned earlier is an important river. We had the initial Mustache Man quote to show that as recently as the middle of the last century, people were very, very aware of the importance of this waterway. The point is, however, that this situation shifted. So here we have Europe during the Cold War, or at least Cold War 1.0. And we can see that in many respects, the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union extended even further. They did not have Finland anymore, but when you include the Warsaw Pact countries, over which the Soviet Union exercised, I wouldn't say total control, but a great deal of control, they pushed even further into Europe. Now, what happened afterwards is that there was this pushback after 1991. Now, some of the aspects of this started before that, but really following 1991, when Russia appeared to be, and probably was, at its weakest historically, we saw that these former Warsaw Pact members got drawn in. Germany reunited, and Russia, or the USSR, whatever it was at that point, the Commonwealth of Independent States or whatever, it got pushed back basically in the direction where, to the degree, to the territorial extent indicated here in red, though, of course, all of that was falling apart very quickly in the Caucasus and the Baltics. So, it didn't last long. But I'm just trying to show you the way in which the front line between East and West, so to speak, shifted. And now we can take a look at the situation. Now, of course, most of you will know this already. Certainly people in Europe will be very well aware of it. And I know Praise of Folly certainly knows about this. But just to get a quick glimpse of where we stand today in terms of European Union member countries. Now, this doesn't overlap entirely with the Schengen zone. So there are some differences and some details in here. But this is the size of the EU at present, including these countries that the EU Commission has indicated they will back for membership. Ukraine and Moldova. This just happened in the last week or two, where announcements were made that they were going to bring Moldova in as a candidate, Ukraine as a candidate. These things are, very. It would not make sense for most people, given the kind of requirements that the EU has in place, that Moldova, a very, very poor country with its own separatist region backed by Russia, Transnistria, that this country would be fast tracked for membership. But I think we're going to cover some of the reasons why, and we're going to discuss, how these moves are being dictated by Russia's moves in Ukraine to some extent, at least from the perspective of the Europeans. And then we can see here in terms of NATO that Russia has been pushed back quite a bit. You've got these, countries like Ukraine, where Russia is asserting itself now, and Belarus, which, if you've been watching the news over the last year, there was a whole period where the reports were trying to make it seem as though there was real friction between the leader of Belarus and Putin, and that, the country was separate. But now with Russian intermediate range missiles being based there, it seems that Belarus has had it explained to them and is back in the fold. Of course, you can see Kaliningrad there, which is sort of Russia's compromised defensive position in the face of the changes that have happened in Sweden, Finland, and very much so in the Baltics, with the Baltics entering NATO, and now Sweden and Finland are going to be coming in, it looks like, and fairly quickly. Though, people like Alexander Mercouris recently, he was arguing that, well, it's pretty much a fait accompli anyway. Sweden and Finland were already very much cooperating with NATO, and that Sweden even had some sort of read between the lines defense pacts with the United States that don't often get discussed. So some people would argue that, that's not a big deal because it's doing is commemorating or in some sense, making official something that has been sort of a reality on the ground for quite some time. So this is what we've seen in terms of shifting borders and Russia's positions. Now, there's just one other thing I want to throw in here from Google Earth. I've mentioned this many times before, but for those who are joining us for the first time, hopefully you can see my cursor here. Yeah, it looks like you can. If you look from Kaliningrad's southeasternmost point here, which is right here where Poland and Lithuania come together with Kaliningrad. If you draw a line across Europe right here, down into the area of Odessa, the Black Sea here, Transnistria, which is basically right here, this is the narrow waist of Europe. And as I've said many times before, I'll just say it briefly here. If you're dealing with defending a huge front like that, the classic land war in Asia, the ability to shorten that front has a very real effect upon your ability to concentrate troops along that line. And as we saw with World War II, when the mid-century Germans were pushing their way into Russia and Russia was trying to push back here and there, you ended up with these huge bulging salients that would run for at least hundreds and hundreds of miles. So if instead of a nice, neat line across here, you imagine something that's slithered like a repeating kind of S shape along here, which would be the reality of warfare, you'd have an enormous front, because it would, like, if you pulled that string of the line taut, so to speak, it might end up out here in the North Atlantic, because it winds about so much. So that can have a real effect upon how troops can be concentrated. And so just because of the reality of geography, I tend to think, and also because of the fact that after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was most insistent upon maintaining control of Kaliningrad. And right about that time in 91, you had a whole group of Russian-speaking people in Moldova who said, and many Russians themselves, Russian minority and the rest, they said, "Oh no, we're gonna create our own little breakaway region here, Transnistria, and we don't want to go fully with Moldova. We're gonna keep our options open. We have a history with Russia." Well, Russia supported that and based troops there. So since 1991, Russia has intentionally kept control of this as a little frozen conflict zone, and of Kaliningrad as a little frozen conflict zone, which to me, just looking at the map and seeing that's the narrowest point of Europe's waist this far out. I mean, of course, you can get it skinnier over here with Italy running up through Germany, but for the area under consideration, this is the narrowest spot. So to me, that suggests that this is the general region that they want to keep control of. or at least have sort of pre-established beachheads in Transnistria and Kaliningrad, so that if they had to, they could move to try to close this in some sense. Now, of course, Kaliningrad is up here for other reasons on the Baltic. St. Petersburg is right here. If you take a look at how far the Finnish border is from this major Russian city, I pulled up figures, and I don't know if this is on the highway or as the crow flies, but it's something like 250 miles. And then for the border of Estonia to St. Petersburg, I found one saying that's 210 miles, and then another one saying it's 81 miles as the crow flies. I think the most important thing to understand here is that from the border of a NATO country and a country that's about to be NATO, troops moving over land, if they have roads available to them, could be in St. Petersburg within 4-5 hours, something like that. So that's something else that I want to bear in mind, and all of you should as well as we discuss this. Then I wanted to point out about the Danube, right? If we go back here and we take a look at the Russian Empire once upon a time, you can see down here, here's the Danube. And then over here, you can see the Dniester, right? The Dnieper will likely be important. I think there's at least some possibility that Russia would want to try to push as far over as the Dnieper in order to have a better barrier and to control and consolidate their growing possessions now in the Ukraine. But we'll have to see how that goes. I'm also of the opinion that since Transnistria is right down here, that, and others have said this as well, they pushed as far over as Kherson and a little past it. It seems very, very likely that they are going to continue overland and connect to Transnistria. And why? In addition to the fact that they've already got troops in Transnistria, why would I say such a thing? Well, you have to look at the Danube River. Now, Romania controls the mouth of the Danube now, but the thing is that via Transnistria, which allows Russia to freeze Moldova, they have a tiny little spot here where they can control some of that river. And there is a commission. There is a commission for the Danube River that is, the members of it are the riparian, that means bordering on the river, states. And others get involved, if they're a part of the drainage basin for that and all the rest. Well, if they can get themselves a foothold on this river, this is the longest river in Europe. And it runs through at least 10 countries, if I'm remembering correctly. I had some facts pulled up about it, which I'll take a look at here in a moment. But what's important to understand is this river runs all the way to Germany. And Germany is very big with its industrial centers. Let me see if I got my notes here. There we are. Let's go on this one. If I can just pull this up. Yeah, Germany's industry, including metals giant ThyssenKrupp and chemicals giants Bayer and BASF, they've developed in centers close to waterways such as the Rhine. The network of rivers and canals in Germany remains the most extensive in Europe and is used to move around 200 million tons of freight each year. And that includes grain and coal and oil. Inland waterway navigation, for example, on the Rhine, the Danube, they talk about others like the Moselle, also the canals. They contribute to the economic strength of these waterways. And that's certainly the case. One of the reasons that Germany was able to jump ahead industrially so quickly is that they have waterways and canals all over Germany, and not just the ones they built up themselves. They have a really, really good basis in terms of their existing river systems. Now, this is changing, and there are people complaining about how they flood, when there's heavy rain, and it can cause real damage to these picturesque little towns. But for the time being, the Danube and all of this is very, very important. Part of that is because here's the Danube, here's the mouth of the Danube, and here it runs down through Romania, it runs across Bulgaria, up through the Balkans, the Iron Gates, Serbia, right? It runs up through Austria into Germany. And then there's a set of canals that connect it to the Main and the Rhine rivers. So you have to understand that this entire waterway is like a major industrial and energy transit corridor. And when you think about things like Russia having cut a deal to provide gas to Serbia, which it's trying to keep in its loop, and the fact that the situations in Ukraine and the rest have cut off gas supplies, but Turkey is doing the Turk Stream thing in cooperation with Russia that allows gas to get in. There are other ways to get it in that can run, in theory, all the way out here to the North Sea. The Dniester, which they get some control of the mouth of through Transnistria, also has a big drainage basin. It's not, of course, as big as the Danube, but this is a major river, and it has it's a central part of everything going on in the eastern Ukraine, from agriculture to industrial processes and logistics and navigation to just drinking water, which is likewise a very, very important thing about the Danube. So let me see. Did I have yeah, I'll jump out of the maps now for a moment, and we can just start taking a look at what we have going on. Or maybe I'll just leave up the Google Earth one so we all have something to look at to orient ourselves. We have a number of different areas where I think things are going to be happening. I expect that Russia is probably going to try to do some things internally in the Baltic states. Now, I am no expert on this, but my guess is that they're going to be less likely to have much success there, though they do have Russian minorities in some or all of these countries. But the population here is only about 6 million for all Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And they have a history of having problems with the Russians. The nationalists are very much against the idea of, any kind of compromise. And they're backed by NATO, who want to add to their reaction forces and everything else. Nevertheless, I think Russia's probably going to be doing some things here, though I don't know how much success they'll have with trying to do things internally and sub rosa. Alexander Mercouris, as I said, was saying that he thinks Sweden isn't going to be it doesn't matter. It's already sort of unofficially been with the West this long anyway, so who cares? And that Finland is a similar thing. I tend to think that Russia takes the issue of Finland a little more seriously. Sharing such a long border with it, I can't imagine that they're just going to let it go. That said, I have no idea what they're going to do. And from what I've heard from the few Finns that I've asked about this, they said that nationalism is at a fever pitch, and the normies as well. They're all like, woo, 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 it's the best thing ever. Let's go, NATO. It'll actually make us safer. As I said, I expect definitely something to happen with Moldova. And I want to leave some room for Praise of Folly to talk here. So I'm just going to very briefly tap these Bulgaria. We're in fact seeing things happen now. I think that is one of the best bets they have for making things happen internally in that country in ways that suit them rather than NATO. I think they have big opportunities in Moldova to do it as well. And with Moldova, they get a little piece of the Danube. With Bulgaria, the Danube runs along their border. And then it's important to remember that the Danube is critical in terms of reconnecting with Serbia. Everybody should remember that Lavrov tried to fly over to Serbia here recently, and all these NATO countries said, screw you, buddy, we're not allowing you to cross our airspace. But Vucic is, I had not paid much attention to him before, but listening to him talk and seeing how he controls his demeanor, I think that dude is formidable. So we'll see what's happening here. And he's trying to walk a fine line. The Republika Srpska or whatever in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia itself have not joined in on the sanctions that the EU wanted them to. And Russia just cut a good gas deal with them with great prices. And this at a time when all hell is likely to break loose across the rest of Europe once winter comes. So these are a few spots. Because Serbia is being blocked from the Adriatic, I think there's also some things that could happen here in Montenegro. But I expect we should at least keep our eyes closely on Montenegro, Serbia, Bulgaria, Moldova, and up here on the Baltics and on Finland, as well as on Turkey, because Erdogan seems to be playing both sides of the table. And that means that, just about anything could happen there. Now, what I'll do is I'll pull the map away, and Praise of Folly, I'll let you jump in here and share with our viewers your thoughts on these various areas, as well as anything else you feel I might have missed. I'll drop the map, but if you need it up again, just let me know.
All right, yeah. So I think the first place we need to start with is what is Russia's position on the world stage, and how does that affect the decisions Russia's making? So the first thing to look at is the European plain, which stretches from Germany all the way to the Ural Mountains, which the further east you go, the wider it gets. So imagine the cross section of like a funnel, and then you look at that cross section. And then you have the narrow end tapered to the west and the broad end tapered to the right, to the east. It's going to get wider and wider as you go. Okay. Now Russia wants to push that plain defense line as far west as possible because it makes it more narrow. Also, Russia is still dealing with a demographic crisis beginning before the collapse of the Soviet Union. As of last year, 2021, Russia suffered the largest population shortfall since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, what this means is that this is the largest the Russian military is going to be for the next till the end of the century. So if Russia doesn't do anything now, it won't be able to do anything at all. So you have this sort of interesting paradox, whereas the population is about to decline, it encourages Russia to be more aggressive. Because what Russia needs to do is it needs to defend itself on fronts that are sufficiently narrow and defensible that with its reduced population in the future it can do so. And so there's three main ranges that it's trying to control. The first one it wants to control is it wants to abut up against the Carpathian Mountains. So the Carpathian Mountains would stretch from the bottom of the Czech Republic all the way down to the Ukrainian Moldovan border, or the Romanian Moldovan border. And ideally, again, there's NATO countries involved here, so who knows if Putin can actually pull this off. But ideally, you'd want to drop a line from Gdansk straight down. Gdansk is the old city of Danzig. Drop it straight down to the Carpathian Mountains. That would be bisecting Poland. And you'd also want to look at the coastal regions that you mentioned earlier, Semigog and Romania. So between the Carpathian Mountains and the Black Sea, there's a small coastal area. So if they could get to those 2 points on the Carpathians, Russia would be able to, in its own strategic analysis, defend these positions with a reduced population. The second mountain range they want to control is the Caucasus, specifically the North Caucasus, which, looking at the Grozny situation in the 90s, it was crucial that they keep control of Grozny because it's north of the Caucasus, which would then weaken their position vis-a-vis their own defensiveness. Now, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan are what we would call the South Caucasus, and they lost them. But as long as they can control the North Caucasus, they can defend themselves. Now, you had mentioned this, Semyogog, in one of your discussions with Prudentials, I think Sunday, that there was I think it was called the Iron Gates. There was the gates that were all the nomads would pour in through the Caucasus, and during the Middle Ages, the Persians and the Byzantine Empire, and later the Byzantines and the Muslims, would do joint operations to guard that so the nomads couldn't pour through. So Russia wants to control that region. And then the other mountain range they want to control is the Pamir Alai Mountains, which border Uzbekistan and Iran. And if they can get to those 3 mountain ranges, what they can do then is control those territories with a minimum of manpower resources. Now, all the Central Asian republics are a part of the Commonwealth of Independent Systems, and Russia has a significant amount of influence over them due to its control of gas and oil. So in all likelihood, they don't need to worry about those nations shaking free. They've already got control of the North Caucasus, so they're really trying to get to the Carpathian Mountains. And many of the nations you mentioned, the Baltic states, Moldova, Ukraine, Romania, they're all standing in the way of Russia's goal for that. So to the end, so we're going to shift over to Europe and forget the other mountain ranges for the moment. At the end of the Cold War, as you said, there was the Transnistria Breakaway Republic was created in order to keep an ongoing destabilizing influence in the region. One of Russia's war goals in this current Ukraine war is most likely to link up with the Transnistrian Republic and either annex directly or incorporate Moldova. Obviously, the Baltic states, they want to do something about that. So what Putin, I think, is thinking about is obviously an attack on a NATO member would be prohibitively expensive due to Article 5. So what I think he's trying to do with Ukraine is create a crisis of credibility. Can the United States back up what it's saying? And so one of the things we've noticed with a lot of Eastern European countries, specifically Bulgaria and Serbia, the old Soviet socialist parties did not go away. They rebranded themselves. And with the current crisis in the Ukrainian parliament where the government collapsed, it collapsed because the Bulgarian Socialist Party withdrew from the coalition, which is a pro-Russian party. And NATO has been concerned for a long time that Bulgaria might not be a reliable ally in the struggle against Russia. Many of these Balkan countries as well, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, owe their independence to Russia. So in the 10th Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, the initial Treaty of San Stefano, which was going to cripple Turkey, got all the other great powers of Europe to come together and say, no, you can't do that, Russia. So they had the Treaty of Berlin in 1878. But in that treaty, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro all gained independence. They're all Slavic, they're all Orthodox. So there is this historic national connection to Russia, which I think Russia is going to hopefully, from Putin's point of view, would be to break them away from NATO by supporting pro-Russian political parties that could win elections, that could leave NATO and join a Russian alliance. Because again, attacking them directly isn't going to be viable. Also, from the point of view of their strategic influence in the Black Sea, obviously Turkey's been a rival to Russia in that region for centuries. They don't want NATO to control Romania or Bulgaria with naval assets in the region, because Turkey, which is also a NATO member, would give them complete control over the Black Sea, which, say, even in World War II, the Axis naval presence was minimal. The Soviet Navy was more dominant in the region, and in World War I, the Russian Navy was dominant over the Ottoman Navy in the region. So they want to keep control of the Black Sea. Also, the importance of Crimea and Kaliningrad is that they are warm water ports. They're free from ice year-round. One of the reasons why Kaliningrad Oblast, which is an exclave of Russia, is still part of Russia is because after World War II, the Germans that lived in East Prussia were ethnically cleansed and expelled to Germany. So really, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the way a lot of these lines were drawn were ethnic. So there'd be ethnic, Baltic peoples, ethnic Central Asian peoples, ethnic South Caucasus peoples. But Kaliningrad is just Russian. And so they felt no need to leave. That's where the Russian Black Sea Fleet is stationed. That's where they have long-range missiles and long-range bombers, both of which are nuclear capable, which allows them to strike into Central Europe, greatly extending Russia's threat range. So we see that they have this, their concern is a declining population and being able to defend themselves, because north of these three mountain ranges, the Carpathians, the Caucasus, and the not the Altai Mountains, the Pamir Alai Mountains, and Russia's flat. So if you look at, so to the west, we have the European plain, which I just discussed. But south of, say, Moscow, we have what's called the Western Steppe, which stretches from Hungary to the Altai Mountains in Mongolia, which is all flat. Now, it's very fertile areas, which is why Ukraine and southern Russia and Kazakhstan are known for their grain imports and exports, rather, and agricultural production. But none of that's defensible. You can't defend any of that. And so Russia needs to move to these defensible positions, if at all possible, because they can't afford to give them up because they're resource rich and very valuable to Russia's economy. But they have to get to a point where they can actually defend them. Now, the other reason why Kaliningrad is important is because of the Suwalki Gap. Now, what I just said about the North European plain has one caveat, and that's around Kaliningrad, because northeastern Poland has the Morasian Lakes, a series of marshes of which Russia and Germany fought in over World War I. And then Belarus is mostly marshland with the Pripyat and Minsk marshes. So it creates an artificial bottleneck for invading armies to go through. And then, of course, the Baltic Sea to the north. So that's like the one caveat to the plain, the European plain. And so that 100-kilometer stretch of land is crucial then for any attack into Russian areas or into Poland in the west. And so also that then sort of breaks up the North European plain. So in Ukraine, you have to draw a line from, say, Belarus to Odessa, which then creates another gap for an invading army to go through. And so German Army Group North went through the Suwalki Gap, and German Army Group South went through the corridor into Ukraine. And so all of these pressures are conditioning Russia to do this. And I think their goal is to get pro-Russian parties in these Eastern European governments to fragment NATO. Furthermore, Germany has a 2040 war game plan where NATO collapses and breaks up due to internal instability, and they have to make moves for their own strategic geopolitical safety. I think if Germany fears that that's an actual possibility, Russia is going to want to accelerate that as much as possible. Because if NATO collapses, then Russia can just flood in and take all that it wants. Now, what does the United States want out of this? I think the United States thought that Russia was done after 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia wasn't supposed to come back, but it has come back. And so if you look at this, I think what we're going to see here is a day or two after Russia invaded Ukraine in February 25th, 26th, Hillary Clinton tweeted that we're going to turn Ukraine into the second, bear trap, essentially, in the same way that Russia was bogged down in Afghanistan, which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The implied threat is obvious. The Russian Federation will collapse if it gets bogged down in a Ukraine war. And I think that's ultimately what they want. Now, that's on the face of it crazy. Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal. If there's a power vacuum in Central Asia where Russia collapses, especially under pressure from NATO expansion, A, will it use nuclear weapons to postpone the inevitable? And even if it doesn't, who is going to acquire those nuclear weapons once Russia collapses? That will lead to a scramble between non-state actors, NATO nations, and China to pick up Russia's nuclear arsenal, which could lead to all sorts of disasters. Now, as a further overlay to the strategic goals of Russia and the strategic goals of the United States, I think the conflicts that we're going to be seeing in these regions are going to have a lot more in common with 19th century conflicts, like the Russian conquest of the Caucasus, Russia's conquest of Central Asia, the Great Game between the British Empire and the Russian Empire, and then even if we look at U.S.-Soviet tensions in Central Asia over Afghanistan, it has that Great Game vibe. Because these wars are going to be fought for resources and energy and national ethnic interests rather than ideologies, like, say, the Cold War, democracy versus communism, or World War II, National Socialism versus communism. And I think that will be a change there. Now, one of the things that we can see is Ukraine has proven itself willing to dam up the Dnieper River in order to prevent water from getting to Crimea, which I think it's 80% of its drinkable water from the Dnieper. So if any one of the nations that abuts against the Danube is friendly to Russia, I don't know if they'll quite dam it up. But one thing that you could expect them to do is make it very difficult to transit goods across their portion of the river. And if they make it complicated and painful enough, it can really gum up the gears of trade into Eastern Europe and then into the Black Sea. So there's that element as well. Now, in the Caucasus, we had recently, as of 2002, Armenia and Georgia fought over some disputed territories, of which Armenia lost. Georgia had backing from the Turks. It was able to use drones effectively to surveil the territory and fire guided munitions. And right now, currently, Russia and Turkey are having a joint peacekeeping operation in the disputed area. But with the Caucasus, now Georgia itself has part of its territory occupied, South Ossetia. Now they want to have NATO membership, and they've wanted to have that for some time. Russia's invasion in the region in 2008 was provoked by the Rose Revolution, which toppled a pro-Russian regime in 2005, and he was the pro-NATO president was going to build a NATO base, and Putin put a stop to that. Whether Georgia joins NATO or not is going to be an interesting question, because Putin's original concern in his Empire of Lies speech was that if Ukraine joins NATO, that will trigger Article 5 because Russia occupies Crimea. Well, if Georgia joins NATO, then that will trigger Article 5 because Russia occupies South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So, will Russia just invade Georgia to preempt any attempt at a NATO inclusion? I think it will, in light of what happened in Ukraine. So I think right now it's going to be on the back burner for a while because there's no way Georgia could stand up to a full-scale Russian invasion to preempt a NATO alliance. One could see Russia and Turkey coming to blows over issues in Armenia and Azerbaijan because they take up different sides, and that's going to have a religious component to it. Russia and the Armenians are Orthodox. The Azerbaijanis and the Turks are both Turkic speakers and also Muslims, Sunni Muslims. So we could see that as an issue there. Now, as far as Lithuania and the Baltic states, Lithuania's mentioned that it's enforcing EU sanctions on Russian goods going in and out of Kaliningrad. Now, that does not include passengers. That does not include food. It's more heavy industry, things like steel. Russia can still supply Kaliningrad through naval routes, but they're going to be much more expensive. The president of Estonia recently said that if Russia will not back down, so she was correct in gauging, I think, Russia's determination. And she said that there's fears in Estonia that if Russia invades the Baltic states, NATO won't defend them and will just rush to the negotiating table to hold the Suwalki Gap, which that's interesting. I don't really that was just the Estonian fear. I don't really know much more about that, whether NATO would actually. I mean, it's difficult to envision NATO not defending them because if they don't defend the Baltic states, then NATO's a dead letter. All sorts of nations will jump ship. Romania will probably jump ship. Bulgaria will probably jump ship. But if they defend, then does that risk a nuclear war? But right now, as of currently, Russia has started cyber warfare against Lithuania, saying, "Okay, well, we're not going to attack you directly because of Article 5, but we'll uh, disrupt your industry and economic activities with that." So I think for starters, this is a sort of overlay of the conflict zone. Lastly, I guess what I'll add is all of this is occurring in what Spikeman called the Rimland. So the Heartland, which is the basis of modern geopolitical thought, is that area of Eurasia not accessible by sea power, which basically extends from, Moscow to the Dnieper River to, Central to Mongolia and China. And then the Rimland is like Europe, including Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and India and China. So these are going to be Rimland conflicts. What I see going on in this area, what I call the Rimland resource wars, where the Rimland will be a battle zone for the resources there to control the world island.
Fair enough, and thank you. There are a few things I would want to throw in there, some touches on the Caucasus. First off, Georgia was hoping that it would be listed as a candidate, and the EU held off on doing that. Also, I am not clear. Maybe some people in the chat can help me to get my head around this, people who might have been following it more closely. But as I understand it, there's a former leader of Georgia, I want to say Saakashvili, but I cannot remember exactly, who is currently being held in prison. And the pro-West people in Georgia are like, oh, that's a terrible thing. I can't imagine why that's happening. I think that Georgia, the current leadership in Georgia, is trying to walk a knife edge with things. As you pointed out, Russia had, and I've mentioned this on many of my streams, has turned basically Abkhazia, which is they're basically Circassians. They're another one of these groups like Abaza or these other groups, Shapsug and the rest, Adige. They speak a language that's very, very close, and they were historically enemies of Russia because Russia came in and more or less ethnically cleansed them from the Caucasus. There's a huge diaspora in 1865, 64, and afterwards, of course. So Abkhazia got pulled around, and that strengthened Russia's ability to basically freeze Georgia, as it enjoys doing and has done in many countries, many places. It's one of its strategies. Freeze the country, create a frozen conflict. Nothing can move forward diplomatically. If they can't control everything, they at least have a decisive veto power in being able to throw that country into chaos. I expect that's the card they're going to play in Moldova. I think Georgia is very concerned that they can do this. You talk about their control of the North Caucasus, but their taking of the Georgian military highway, and there's a second one. It's actually the South Ossetia sits directly over one of the routes that are sort of intertwined. They cross each other in spots. It's basically a spur line off of the old Georgian military highway that General Yermolov put in place at the cost of so many Russian lives during the Caucasian Wars. And so basically South Ossetia, everyone's like, oh, it's the South Ossetians, this poor little South Ossetia. It's because it's the Georgian military highway. It's a group of passes that allow transit north to south across the Caucasus year round. So Georgia has got to watch its step. And I think the EU probably held off on saying they're going in immediately because that's a place where Russia could create considerable chaos pretty quickly. So the Caucasus, also the business with Georgia and the rest, and Armenia here. There's, I forget the name of it. I think it starts with a G, but there's a major gorge that runs along this area. Let me pull the map up here. That is a perfect transit point for running pipelines. And in some respects, there already are pipelines running here. But running from the Caspian to the Black Sea, this is an area where there's been a bunch of things flaring up, right? So, and then we have the more recent conflict where Turkey got involved again, which is, as you know, with Azerbaijan and Armenia. And as you rightly observed, Russia is backing Armenia, but they're playing it very loosely. They're staying back. They've got peacekeeping forces there, but the conflict, by the way, is not completely over. You know, there still is shelling and problems and things. So this is all on hold. It seems to me all this area of the Caucasus seems to be in a holding pattern, and Europe wants to play it very safe with Georgia at this point, and they probably want to squeeze them for some more things. But Georgia is not a realistic place for them to play this game, partially because you talked about, you know, triggering, what was it, Article 5, right? So I think Georgia, we're going to have to watch closely. That's a place where we could see some things shift, but Georgia is a country that is likely at least as susceptible to corruption as Bulgaria. So that's a place where Russia, if they wanted to, could start pulling levers, and they haven't yet, as best I can tell. Bulgaria over here, there's something going on with North Macedonia, and there is a fight about how Bulgaria wants to block the North Macedonia moving into the EU, and they've been on the list now for something like 20 years. It's very interesting also, by rushing to give Ukraine and Moldova possible, giving them candidate status. There are a bunch of people in the West Balkans who are like, fuck you very much. We've been waiting for years for this to go into play. And here you are, Moldova. I mean, when I was in Turkey as recently as 2008, 9, 10, I mean, Moldova basically sends all the nannies and the house cleaners to Turkey so they can actually make a living, because the country is very poor. No, not throwing shade at them, but they've got real problems. They are absolutely not the kind of country that you would expect the EU to leap on getting a hold of. But my suspicion, and I've mentioned it many times, is there's a major energy play going on with the Black Sea. And Russia wants to block it because they can provide energy to Europe and keep, Europe on the tit, right? Because they can turn the tap off. And I believe that the reason that you see, this is all sheer speculation, ladies and gentlemen, but I believe the reason you saw people like Biden, rolling in there into Ukraine and showing such a close interest in it and lining his pockets so nicely, it seems, in that fashion, it's because there's a major energy play that was going to happen here. And basically, Europe would be able to pull gas in from the Black Sea to meet many of its needs and reduce its dependence on Russia. Now, if you go checking out all the various resources out there right now, you'll hear a lot of talk about diversification, and not in the sense of importing replacement populations, but in this sense, diversifying their energy supplies. And they recognize that they're up against a wall in many respects. And so they've long wanted to diversify this area and get very rich off it. But Russia has neatly stepped in, reestablished their presence in Crimea, which is, of course, the naval base of Sevastopol, which is the home of the Black Sea Fleet. I and many others who know more about it than I do believe that Russia will move overland and connect with Transnistria. And that would give them the northern Black Sea littoral. Georgia likely wouldn't be able to do much because it is under threat of destabilization, I believe. Now, Romania, as best I can tell, I think Moldova is so corrupt and so screwed up and so poor that they could be easily destabilized by the Russians, despite all the best efforts of NATO and the rest, because it's Russia's old backyard. This area was formerly Bessarabia, and Russia has maintained a presence there for quite some time, going back and forth with the Ottomans over that. Romania, I don't know that Romania would be as easily flipped over to the Russian side as you surmise. That is because the Romania is very, very important for its coastline. It's got a relatively large army. It's it's big geography. It also controls, along with Serbia, there at one spot, the Iron Gates, where the Danube passes further, which is like a gateway
If I could
into.
just interject real quick, what I said about Romania was only contingent on NATO not defending the Baltic states. So if Russia invades the Baltic states and NATO does nothing, then I suspect Romania might leave. But short of that, which again, that's a really high stakes hypothetical. Yeah, I don't think Romania would leave the NATO alliance.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And yeah, I agree. If something happened with the Baltics, it could shift everything. But as it stands, from everything I've been able to tell, I mean, the last time I was in Romania was '96, and it was a screwed up, depressing place. There were still, bullet holes from riots, and, the burgers didn't have any meat in them. But since that time, large amounts of money have been poured into there. They're very much a NATO and EU country now. And from the news I've looked at over the last couple months, there's been all kinds of flurries of visits. Joe Biden's wife was there. There's talk about how they're only going to be flying MiG fighters for their Air Force for a short time, which means everybody over there is about to make their own little cut of all the military industrial complex deals. Romania seems to be fully in, and my expectation is that it's going to be hardest for Russia to turn Romania. As I understand it, someone in a chat a few episodes back on one of my streams mentioned that the NATO command for the Black Sea is also in Romania. So that, I think, emphasizes they can almost get a frozen conflict that would destabilize Romania by creating it in Moldova. And so that, I think, is the route that they're likely going to take, especially if they connect over land there. But Bulgaria is the other one where I think they're going to go after it. Because why is Bulgaria holding off on North Macedonia? Yes, likely they're doing it just because everybody wants to line their pockets a little bit before they say yes. They're waiting for a better deal, kind of like Erdogan, with Sweden and Finland. But Bulgaria, as you pointed out, the commies never went away. They rebranded. And in Bulgaria specifically, from what I'm able to tell, this is not my area, but it seems to me that Bulgaria, it's actually a slap in the face to the recent prime minister who had to step down, and now he has to form a new government, and he's got to go hat in hand to the guy he displaced to get his assistance to move forward. So this business with North Macedonia and Bulgaria, I think that's tied to Serbia and Russian interests. I also think, as I said before, because of the Danube, which I think everyone should bear in mind, it's less important than it was in the 19th or early 20th centuries, but it's still a critical industrial and transit, logistical and, watershed, everything. It's critical, largest river, longest river in Europe. And as I said, it connects to the North Sea. So I think Russia, through the canal system in Germany to the Rhine and main rivers. I think Russia is going to be looking at Bulgaria as a way to get to Serbia. And that means that that's another place where I expect they'll pull a lever. And North Macedonia may well at this point be on hold because of Russian machinations in Bulgaria, because that bears on their intention of not letting Serbia drift off into NATO land. And from everything I've heard, Serbia has taken money from China and from Russia. They're still buying arms from Russia. The only issue they're facing now is that Montenegro seems to have gone a little bit towards the pause and is blocking Serbian access to the Adriatic. Now, this is not my area. I don't know all these details. People who are actually there on the ground and living this stuff, they can doubtless correct the general picture I'm putting together here. But I believe we're likely to see games in this area. I don't think they're going to invade the Baltic because they don't need to, especially with Kaliningrad. I think they just need to wreak havoc there and then make them pay a price once it becomes clear that it's really difficult for them to get their energy needs met and all the rest. Also, again, right down here at this little tip of Moldova, they do touch the Danube there. And so if Russia ended up basically taking control officially or unofficially, and I think unofficially is much more likely, put their own group in, right? That makes them one of the riparian states on the Danube. They get a vote, right? And of course, their fleet in the Black Sea will allow them to exert pressure on other countries along the Danube, like Romania and Bulgaria. What was the other thing I wanted to mention? Black Sea gas, I covered. Romania all being in. Another thing to point out is that Orban recently did his thing with emergency powers. And that was so that he could shepherd his country through what is likely to be a very interesting winter without having to get locked up in parliamentary debate and all the rest. The other thing is that Hungary borders Serbia. And if I remember correctly, Hungary also has, yeah, absolutely. The Danube runs, I mean, Buda and Pest are on either side of the damn river. So Hungary could be a secret weapon depending on what they try to do and what kind of relationships they attempt to maintain that could give Russia a kind of access. But I really think that they're going to want to go after Bulgaria as well, because if they do that, essentially what they've got is Bulgaria, Serbia, to some extent Hungary, and Moldova. And if Western Ukraine becomes a rump state, then they basically, you see what's happening here? They've surrounded Romania, which is the major point of investment for NATO in terms of having Black Sea access and the country that's least likely to turn loose of everything, you know, in terms of their relationships with NATO. So there are two other points I want to make, and then I'll ask for your thoughts on these. The first one is that, well, there are two scenarios I think going on here. One is vis-a-vis Russia. And that is that the EU feels desperately that it has to move now. It must move now, right? Time is short. That's constantly what you hear. The diversification, well, we're going to have an energy shortfall. You know, you have people like Zelensky, as Mercouris has mentioned, you know, talking about how this has to be settled by winter. They know they need energy. They had been hoping, I think, to answer that need in large part through things in the Black Sea, which is very likely why, oddly, the whole thing of Eastern Mediterranean gas development just got turned off. And Biden just shut it down when it seemed to be going somewhere. And it could, at full capacity, have met something like 10% of Europe's needs. These are all small, you know, within a year, you know, within a yearly time frame. But this is small, but that's significant. And they know, they're constantly talking about how they have to, you know, they can get LNG from tankers. They can push Norway to produce more. You know, they can look at, you know, maybe reopening coal plants as they're doing, and perhaps France could get some more of its nuclear energy going. You know, they're looking at doing anything they can. And yet that got shut down. And why? I think it's because everybody was going to have a happy day, and they were all going to go home, you know, happier than a pig in the sunshine in a field of shit, because they would have hit a home run with Black Sea energy, taken control of Ukraine, moved around Russia, and said, screw you, Ivan, you know. But that didn't happen. And so now they feel that they have to move very, very quickly. There's a sense of urgency. And so they're moving quickly to say, well, no, now Ukraine, they're candidates. And Moldova, by gum, they're candidates too. Let's do it, man. We're ready. They have to see that they have a future. We have to peel them away from Russia. And Bulgaria, like some of these countries aren't even in the Schengen zone yet, because they really aren't stabilized yet. They really haven't met all the requirements. They've already expanded beyond their means. These countries are all hanging like remora fishes off the belly of Germany and France and other countries with real income. And so what you see here is a need. They're not going to, these areas of the Eastern Balkans, they're not doing it because they love Germany. Trust me. They have all kinds of nasty old memories relative to Germany, and, you know, that Serbia certainly doesn't enjoy it. You know, there are lots of countries that have issues with what the EU is doing now and the kind of moves they make to control. The reason that these countries are coming online is because they get a chicken in the pot, and they get, you know, they get their paychecks, so to speak, right? They get paid off. So there's no way that the EU can make this work without pouring money into this. Now, where are they now? They're screwed in terms of energy. Industrial production is going to have to be throttled back. They're going to be figuring out how to heat people's apartments. And all of this is on the heels of what we saw with the coup. This is not a situation where EU is just, you know, hemorrhaging money in all directions in a good way, right? It's just pouring out of them like a fountain. I shouldn't say that. It's not pouring out of them like a fountain. It's hemorrhaging, and it's going to bring them down. And at this point, they're moving to deal with places like Moldova. For people who grew up in the United States, let me tell I mean, I was in Romania, like I said, in 96, 97. It's impossible for people to understand just how corrupt certain aspects of these countries were. And I would guess, somebody in the chat can tell me if things have changed, but I doubt it. There are core aspects where they're just going to be a sponge. It's like the EU is trying to pour money into this area to solidify its support, but it's just a sponge. It's going to run out. You just keep pouring it in. It doesn't provide a foundation for anything. I think that financially and in terms of their credibility, this could crack them. Now, over on the Duran, the Alex guy, as well as Alexander Mercouris, have talked about this being a real issue in terms of their credibility. If they can't deal with this stuff in Ukraine, they're going to have real issues. And I've pointed out on my own streams, if Russia decisively settles the stuff in Ukraine, Turkey is going to move back over to being on the middle line vis-a-vis Russia versus NATO, rather than being sort of more over in NATO, which they've come around to now with Biden back in office. There are going to be real implications for all these other countries, and it could break the EU financially. So that's just from the perspective of Russia. I would imagine that is a part of what they want to do, but I'm going to throw in my most controversial and most speculative take. I'm not saying this is the case, but there is a thing. It's what my old friend Tim used to call the completion function, which is just a name he made up. I doubt it's out of psychology. But if you're looking through leaf cover and branches as a hunter, and you can sort of see one leg in the background and maybe a bit of a tail sticking up and just the snout over here of something, your mind is naturally going to look at it and try to complete that picture to see what it is that's there as a result of these little bits that are showing. Now, again, this is speculation. I'm not saying it's the case, but I think it's at least worth considering that the commies were directly supported by the United States, that Roosevelt was perfectly happy to stand them up against the mid-century Germans, and was perfectly happy. I mean, supposedly everybody went to war to defend Poland, and in the end, it just got given away to the Russians. Like, they're like, ha, fuck you, Poles. You know, Poland's strong. They just screwed them. They screwed Europe. The Marshall Plan completely remade Europe. Hell, we even screwed the Brits, whose economies never recovered. Never, or at least until the Blair days. They were, you know, it was a mess. We smashed Europe. And we did it, the United States, together with the Soviet Union. It worked together like a nutcracker and smashed the hell out of it. And, you know, I'm sure that you could have found Germans in that mid-century period. I'm sure you could have found them saying, yeah, we know exactly what's happening. The commies in the East and the capitalist Americans, so-called capitalist Americans in the West, they're smashing the shit out of us because they want to remove our ability to do anything, destroy our agency and sovereignty, and remake Europe. Well, what's happening now is the EU's getting really big, probably too big for its britches, and is wanting to throw its weight around when it doesn't have standing armies. And all this talk about quick reaction forces, my old friend Tim used to talk about that all the time. He's like, put these motherfuckers together when their NCOs can't talk to each other. You've got a giant army, and the fucking various parts of it literally can't speak to each other on a battlefield unless they happen to have somebody in their unit who speaks English, and the other ones. I mean, it's a mess. It's a real issue trying to have this great rebel alliance, you know, against the empire. They're a paper tiger in many respects, and economically, they're a paper tiger in many respects, and they're teetering on the edge right now because, I mean, things can be cut off further. More pressure can be put on them. So in addition to the idea that it might be Russia just pushing and expecting that they will overextend themselves, and it seems that they are, and they could crash economically in such a fashion that they don't have any more gibs. They got no more gibs to hand out to Romania, to Bulgaria. And believe me, the minute 2 hours before the minute when the gibs end, Romania is fucking out. They are not there because They love democracy and they want trans flags. I guarantee it. So, to take it a step further, I think it's at least worth considering the possibility, and make fun of me, everyone, and you too, please, sir, if you like, because it's fair. But I think it's at least worth considering the possibility that Russia and people further up the food chain in the United States than Biden and his immediate handlers are like, meh, let's do this. Look at how the EU is trying to, or it could also be stupidity. It also could be, right, the idea of fixing the prices globally for energy, like like everything that they're doing seems to be pushing Russia together with China, and further pushing India together with Russia again, which is their old relationship. They're still doing shit like creating BrahMos missiles together. And, India forever, as you must know, was buying their weapons and still is buying their weapons from Russia. Just under Trump, they seem to come over. But now they've been pushed back to Russia as pals. And so you've got a bloc there that can do real things. Take a look at BRICS. Now Argentina and Iran are wanting to be members and have applied, right? And they've got their own version of the IMF and the World Development Bank that they run separately, right? What could be happening here is smashing Europe again and putting into place a Cold War 2.0 that puts two systems online again, rather than one that hopes to be a global system. It may be that they attempted, the snake tried to open its jaws up wide enough to get around the rat of globalism, and they just ran into too many problems for the moment. And my buddy Tim used to say many times in the past, I would be like, what's going on with the ruble, right? Do they trade that currency? And he's like, no, I'm not an expert in this. This might have changed. Anybody who's big on currency and economics, correct me if I'm wrong. But my understanding is that the ruble was not an international currency, that it was tightly controlled by Russia, and that protected them in many ways from the kind of financial manipulations that the West could use to bring things down. But with this rubles for grain, gas for rubles, and this BRICS stuff, and the increasing cooperation with China, and their own moves now that they've announced about making reserve currencies for energy, this really does suggest to me that they're like, shit, we couldn't quite get the whole animal in the jaws of the snake for real globalism. So let's take a fallback position. Let's smash Europe again so it doesn't give us any problems. Because after all, they're Europeans and they've got innovation and intelligence and great universities. Despite all the pause, they're still serious global players, industrial and the rest, or can be. Instead, just smash the shit out of them so they don't have to like it. And essentially, quietly bring Russia online financially as a global power here, not just in terms of energy, and create this second block and just continue to smash Europe in the nutcracker whenever it causes a problem. Because all the things that Biden is doing right now that are supposedly to help Europe, they ain't helping Europe. And the things that Russia's doing right now, they ain't helping Europe either. And yet it's all under this facade, it seems to me, at least a possibility that we should explore, under this facade of, oh no, there's a terrible war between Russia and the West. And, oh, Biden's coming in and America's going to help. It's going to help you, Europe, just like we helped them with the Marshall Plan, just like we helped Britain with Lend-Lease and then took over all their naval bases and became the world's Navy policemen around the world, as the torch was handed off to us as they collapsed on the road after, our predatory financial maneuvers. And I'm not saying they didn't deserve it in many respects. The only place nastier than New York is London. But this, I think, is at least something that we should consider as well. So what do you think of this madness, and what other thoughts do you might have?
Yeah, so to go back to the beginning, I think the reason why Russia's in a holding position in the Caucasus is because they have what they want. They have that mountain range defense, and so now for them, keeping a status quo ante is preferable to future conflicts in the region. Now, you did hint at this, but I think a little bit deeper needs to go into it. Ukraine, as of prior to 2010, we knew had large natural gas reserves, but we didn't really have a good way to get at it. I think it had to do with fracking, which hadn't yet come online. But as of 2010, it became clear that these natural gas reserves were the largest in Europe and would have allowed if Ukraine had been a friendly NATO country, friendly EU country, would have put pressure on Russia's control over Europe by giving the European Union and NATO a kind of energy independence. Now, the first stage of this was Crimea. So along the Black Sea coast of Ukraine, there's a lot of natural gas in the Black Sea. And so Russia, by controlling Ukraine, can then create legal disputes over territorial waters. Who controls those waters? So that would delay Ukraine from exploiting those resources. Then there was the Donbass republics and the Lugansk and Donetsk regions, which, in addition to having coal and grain, also had natural gas. And then the other natural gas is far to the west in Lviv, which is largely outside of Russia's ambitions. But if Russia can achieve control of the Donbass and Lugansk regions, control the Black Sea coast rather, and Crimea, they have vast natural gas reserves. It gives them the same kind of it amplifies their control over the European economy, such that Europe is going to be under their thumb for the foreseeable future. Now, we also have to keep in mind that Europe's population is declining as well, not just Russia's. So that does put Europe at a disadvantage. There's the complacency of the post Cold War NATO, especially in Germany, where prior to the end of the Cold War, Soviet analysts said the West German army was probably the most competent, dangerous NATO force they'd have to fight. But afterwards, a combination of World War II war guilt, and also the fact that, well, the Cold War's over, guys.
And a little bit of pause. Yeah,
a little bit of that too. They weren't even meeting their NATO 2% of GDP. So, but again, it's not just Germany; it's a lot of other nations as well that dropped the ball on this. It is interesting, yeah, with North Macedonia. That was territory that Romania fought over in the Second Balkan War, World War One, and World War Two. And in World War One and World War Two, they did annex from first Serbia and then Yugoslavia this territory, and they consider it part of their own. So we're beginning to see how the Balkan Wars, primarily the Second Balkan War, World War One and World War Two, these sort of traditional conflicts in the Balkans are reasserting themselves. And so one could envision hypothetically that a coalition government led by the Bulgarian Socialist Party leaves, the European Union and NATO, sides with Russia, and then them in Serbia, which gives Russia a corridor to Serbia, and also allows them to put pressure on North Macedonia to buckle under Bulgaria's demands.
One quick question, because it seems you know more about this than I. Do you know what the nature of the dispute, at least that Bulgaria is claiming, is that causes them to block North Macedonia? All I've heard is some things about how North Macedonia has to publicly acknowledge that they share a history with Bulgaria. I mean, I don't even get it. And I've asked around about it. Like I asked Nick Gilvey about it, and I figured he would be in a position to know, and he just never got back to me. So do you know what the nature of this spat is?
Yeah, well, so the Bulgarians, so the heyday of the territorial aspirations of the Bulgarians, where they achieved all their territorial goals, was in World War II. They got control of portions of Greece along the Aegean Sea. They got control of Macedonia. They got control of a sliver of territory on the Black Sea coast of Romania. It has to do with a kind of nationalistic ambitions. I think they view them as Bulgarians. And if you go back to the Middle Ages, the Kingdom of Bulgaria, I think Serbia and the Kingdom of Bulgaria competed over that territory. It's also important because it's very mountainous, so you can use that to anchor your western flank from an invader. Otherwise,
this is very helpful. I don't want to cut you off, but I just want to ask this. So it is entirely conceivable that Bulgaria and Serbia could cut a deal to partition it.
Yeah, I think that's conceivable. Those kinds of partitions in the Balkans are just par for the course, right? They're just carving up the turkey. And yeah, you're right. The European Union, specifically going back to the 2008 financial crisis and austerity measures, basically, now at this point, the UK was a part of the EU still as well. It was the rich EU countries, the UK, France, Germany, and Scandinavian nations, that were subsidizing the rest of Europe, the poor countries, the South. And so Southern European countries like Portugal, well, they call them the pigs, right? Portugal, Italy, Spain, Ireland, yeah, and Greece. And then you have Eastern Europe. And so the UK left with Brexit. So now one of the key economies in Europe is no longer integrated in with the EU.
Very, very
And
good point. Just want to underscore it because it's not only coming off of the business with the coup. It's coming off. I mean, remember all the headlines we read about the withdrawal of the UK, meaning that there are going to be huge financial shortfalls, and how the hell was the EU going to even meet its the financial requirements? So that's a very good thing to bring up. Thank you.
yeah, and so yeah, they've been doing this for 14 years now. And yeah, with especially without the UK, they're gonna have a hard time meeting their financial requirements. Now they want to add all sorts of countries like Ukraine, like Moldova. Now they're doing this for geopolitical reasons. Obviously, it's not economic reasons. They want to block Russia, but yeah, they're going to have tremendous economic shortfalls, and that their energy gambit in the Black Sea rather, in Ukraine is over. Russia's won that gambit. They're over a barrel. I mean, we'll really see things which way the pendulum swings in the fall and winter, because there's no way that Europe is going to get LNG up and running in time for this. First of all, they don't have enough ports for liquid natural gas to be used. Furthermore, I think it was the Netherlands and Germany had nuclear reactors that they were slated to deactivate, and Holland has put that off indefinitely, and Germany's already started reversing that. But again, they don't have enough time. There's not. I mean, that's going to take years, and we're talking about 6 months. So there's a huge energy crisis coming in Europe. I remember hearing one of the German ministers say, "Oh, just wear a sweater." I mean, that's if you're living in one of those, crappy European apartment buildings, wearing a sweater isn't going to cut it. I mean, the other thing too is if Europeans start cutting down the forest for wood, yeah, those forests are gone.
Yeah, and there's not all that much of them left compared to the glory of days past. You can talk about the Black Forest in Germany, but there ain't all that much of it left. Yeah. So when you have these energy problems, you of course have issues with energy prices, and you have issues with inflation, and it's all happening right now. So as you said, this isn't let's just we'll be out of this in 3 years. No, because the crisis, the real nutcracker is, I mean, you know what? Let's go ahead and coin this right here. This is actually a beautiful thing. Why did I not think of this before? Has anyone else thought of this before? If not, I want to put a flag in this bitch. It's the Russian winter. The Russian winter that
Correct.
destroyed Napoleon, the Russian winter that had such an effect on the Germans. This is the Russian winter, except now it's come to Europe, and I don't know. It's just a cuteness, but I think it fits very neatly because that's what they're confronting. They have to do something within this time period. And now that I think about it, Zelensky saying what he did, about how we have to get it taken care of by the winter. I mean, how many Wehrmacht generals, or generals in Napoleon's Grand Armée were saying just the same thing. The other point, excuse me, that I want to raise is that you've got all these talking head women that are appearing everywhere. Like you were talking about the whatever the leader of Estonia, I can't remember if it's president or prime minister, but I've seen the woman speaking, and it's one of these cookie cutter NGO, Harvard or equivalent somewhere, think tank, vat grown spouter of platitudes, and it's exactly the same thing that you see in Moldova, where there's just a brand new female there. And in both in Moldova and in Bulgaria, those people came into power with big EU backing, doubtless NATO and Western and US backing, to just take their money and their largesse and distribute it and hammer the rest of them, dissolve the parliaments, right, and get their own new people elected. And in both Bulgaria and Moldova, they did that. But the thing is that in Bulgaria already we're seeing that it's been turned back around. And they're like, fuck me? Oh no, fuck you.
Yeah.
And in Moldova, I think that can happen in spades. Moldova can become just an absolute mess. So wherever you see these sort of Potemkin village female politicians that sprout up, so whenever they do an interview with Western journalists, the first thing the journalists have to do is genuflect a bit and talk about how, it's such a wonderful thing that you're the first female leader of whatever. That too signals to me that these breastplates are not going to take a musket ball. They're going to fold like tinfoil. They're not proof against the kind of blows that can be brought to bear in these places. I mean, are we to imagine that the Russian intelligence services just left after generations of cultivating contacts and looking at bloodlines and families and files on who does what, and rooms full of maps on all the battles that have been fought in these places and how to take care of problems? The Russians are not incompetent.
Well,
Absolutely
the other
not.
thing too here, right, is what everybody seems to forget is NATO lost in Afghanistan. Let that sink in. Let that sink in, right? We couldn't defeat the Taliban. Okay, like so. Furthermore, if we look at the state of the U.S. military today, as opposed to the beginning of the war on terror in 2001, with the invasion of Afghanistan, 2003, the invasion of Iraq, this is a military that's exhausted. I mean, even as early as 2010, you were hearing all sorts of news reports about soldiers who had seen 6, 7, 8 tours of duty and were just completely exhausted. I mean, it's the levels of exhaustion you'd see on the Eastern Front in World War II. You know, and you had Germans in constant act. No, they had to be in constant action at the time because of the nature of the war. But we have a military that's exhausted from 20 years of war in the sandbox. You know, we might need to add this to another geopolitical statement. You hear, don't start a land war in Asia. Well, don't start a land war in the sandbox because it's not going to end up well. And then furthermore, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think, was sort of a humiliation ritual where the Biden administration just didn't care. They didn't care how embarrassing it looked. It was sort of a, you know, an FU to the servicemen who were over in Afghanistan. And so I feel like the U.S. military is, and then furthermore, with all of the woke, you have there was a guy named Matt Bracken who's an ex-Navy SEAL. A couple of years ago, I was watching him being interviewed, and he was saying that all the friends that he has in the active service are saying that, yeah, it's just like, you know, feminazi groupthink. You can't say anything because the women will rat you out to the, you know, NCOs and higher ups. And so there's nothing you can, you know, men just don't say things anymore. And
Yeah,
if
the Marines can wear rainbow lapel pins for fuck's sake. Yeah, absolutely. Go on.
exactly. Exactly. And so I don't this is not the US Army of, you know, hoorah, George W. Bush, let's roll 2003. Now that was an intimidating fighting force, no doubt. But that's not what Russia would be going up against today if the worst came to the worst and USA deployed troops in Ukraine. Again, I don't know if they're going to do that. It looks like they want to, or at least give the appearance that they want to, but with these chameleons, it's always difficult to tell what they're actually going to do. Now, as to Europe, you know, being, you know, your whole thing about the Nutcracker, I mean, that's even before the United States got involved. That was sort of Britain's strategy with Russia during World War One to use, you know, the continental powers on either opposite ends of the continent to break up the EU. I think one of the reasons why the Europeans are so religiously devoted to the EU is in with the legacy of the two world wars, they're terrified of another continent-wide European conflict. And they're like, okay, this may not be the best deal we got, but we've had 70 years of peace. This is a lot better than, like, you know, another round of internecine struggle that marked Europe throughout most of its history. Now, I don't think you can actually keep this going in the long run. I think the energy crisis is hitting a critical mass where it's just there's no way that Europe is going to be able to weather that storm of energy, and also the solvency. I mean, most of the Southern European and Eastern European countries aren't solvent at all. They had to get bailed out by Germany in the 2008 crisis. So it's really the German and French economies because England left. And I don't think that they have enough. I think what they expected, the EU plan was that the UK stays a part of the EU. They integrate Ukraine into the EU. So they have Germany, France, and England as the economic heart and Ukraine for energy. I don't think they expected the UK to leave, nor Russia to be so aggressive and act so swiftly in Ukraine, which is putting them in a really crisis mode situation. I think also what's interesting too is the fact that for 30 years, my entire adult life, you know, the anti-Nazi, anti-German propaganda has put Germany in this position where they have a small military. Now it's an about face. Schultz has 100 billion euro, but there's two things that Schultz did. One, there's the 100 billion euro fund for the German Bundeswehr, plus promises of annual increases up to and above the 2%. I mean, this is kind of crazy, right? The United States, Poland, yeah, even Poland was mad at Germany for not doing this. So, one of the things I think could happen, and this is a bit of a long shot, but if there's going to be a land war in Eastern Europe, who's going to fight it? Not these like crunchy, liberal, lispy people. It's going to be hard right, you know, badasses, which means they're probably going to. Well, we already know they're willing to collaborate with neo Nazis, with the Azov battalion in Ukraine. I think we're likely going to see NATO forces just turn a blind eye to far right activists. And we might see a putsch where these NATO military units are just like, yeah, we're not going to win any conflict with you people in charge. We're just going to have a putsch and take over. And again, that's a long shot, but I've talked about that in some of my content on my own channel. And I also think what's likely to happen is if we look at the long history of Russia and its neighbors in the Caucasus, in Eastern Europe, in Finland, Scandinavia, they're hated. They're hated everywhere. I feel like that. Yeah, Russia feels the existential pressure to expand into these regions, but I think simultaneously the West Slavs, so Poland, Ukraine, um, the German Slavic population of the Baltic states, and then the Caucasus population, by and large, hates Russia, and I think they'll fight to the last breath. And we're seeing that even if Ukraine can't fight competently, it's fighting with determination and grit. And so the question is, how long can Russia keep this going before they shoot the wad on their manpower reserves, which are again they're so low. That's why they're attacking now. That's the sort of the problem. Now, in the short term, for any broader NATO Russia conflict, whether it's a proxy conflict or, heaven forbid, the Third World War, Russia never gets rid of obsolete equipment, artillery, tanks, ammunition, spare parts. They're all kept in mothball. So, what we've seen with the war in Ukraine is that expensive precision guided munitions are difficult to manufacture. You use them up very quickly. So in future conflicts, what we're going to see are nations hoarding their PGMs for like the critical moment, the decisive battle, and then use them to win the decisive battle and then win the war, but then use more conventional weapon systems uh, throughout most of the conflict. Now, Russia right now has a huge advantage in that area. You could basically use a Katusha in Severodonetsk and it would still work. I mean, it still gets the job done.
The
And
multi-launch rocket systems are pretty much just Katyushas. I mean, they're
yeah,
just Katyushas brought down to date. Yes, but the thing is that artillery works. It
yeah,
works, and their attitude is don't use the expensive stuff where you don't need it. I mean, look at the Mosin Nagant rifle. They call it the garbage rod, right? But how many Germans are dead because of the Mosin Nagant? I mean, it's pretty close to a 30-06. It works, right?
yeah, it works well enough. And the NATO, the way NATO nations buy weapons and arms, it just needs like batches, and you have to buy big batches because it reduces the unit cost of otherwise very expensive materials. So leading up to this conflict, there wasn't a demand for large batch purchases. So right now, Ukraine has absorbed almost all of the surplus material that these nations have. And to scale NATO up to the standards that these nations are required to adhere to by treaty, with the exception of France and Britain, I think it's going to take like 2 or 3 years. I've been looking at the German military budget, and to get German spending and German personnel up to where they want it to be, it's going to take like 2 years. I mean, for Germany, let's not
Yeah,
forget, let alone the
right,
smaller countries.
right, and that's time they don't have. Absolutely, I agree on
It's
that.
time they don't have. Yeah. So at this point, you've also mentioned the BRICS, and yeah, this is a pivot point where Russia, India, China, Brazil are working on building a competitor to the U.S. petrodollar. So I think one way to look at the last 20 years of conflicts in the sandbox is both Muammar Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein were threatening to get out the petrodollar. And we're like, that's not going to happen. So we crushed them. The thing is, Russia and China are nuclear armed peer to peer powers. We can't do that to them. That's not going to work. And they're organizing with India, again, another peer nuclear armed power. Brazil's not, but if it's in the group with the other three, when Russia was banned from SWIFT, the international payment processing system, they kicked online with China, their own international payment processing system. Furthermore, the prodigious amount of famines that are going to develop in Africa because most of what the grain they were purchasing was from Ukraine and Russia. We have Western news saying don't buy grain from Russia if you're an African because it might be stolen from the Ukrainians. And they're on the verge of starvation. So Russia is gaining support in Africa. Russia is gaining support in the Middle East, with especially with like Iran, gaining support in East Asia with China. And it looks like the United States can't count on global solidarity against, say, the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany that it once used to expect. And so that's really interesting. Russia seems to, and this is what Alexander Dugin has been talking about. He wrote a book, I think it was last year, the great, I think it was called The Great Revival versus the Great Reset, where he sort of sees Russia as taking a stand against globalism to allow for the national identities of all the world's nations to flourish vis-a-vis the flattening McDonaldization of globalism. And I remember reading an article recently on Russia Today where they said something quite similar. And it does seem that there is this battle between sort of the BRICS, this alternative to the U.S. global economy, and then what we've seen since the end of World War II, the Bretton Woods consensus is ending. Financial and productive power is shifting to China for at least the immediate future. They already have the productive power. I think the financial power will shift over there as well, especially with their Belt and Road Initiative and how they've had all these development programs. And of course, China's goal is to revive the Silk Road. So the success and power of the Atlantic powers, first the Spanish and Portuguese, the Great Age of Exploration, then the Dutch, then the British, then the Americans, is control of maritime trade. So prior to the 15th century, the great wealth of Asia traveled over the Silk Road to Europe. So ports in the Middle East would then dump resources into Europe, with Venice as the European mediator. Well, with the Great Age of Exploration, these goods were purchased directly by the European powers, which then cut out the middleman. Central Asia used to be a paradise, an idyllic garden of merchant cities. Now it's a wasteland. The Middle East has suffered poorly as well. And China realizes that the way you defeat the Atlantic powers is you basically restore the Silk Road. That's their power. That's where they get this global dominating ability to just boss everybody around. And I think this is the big pivot. I think Mackinder's heartland is beginning to be built.
Yeah, there's some real issues with that. I agree with you. The main thing is that they want to have an overland route for trade. And, China has for quite some time been focusing on inexpensive, but sufficient, inexpensive train lines of sufficient quality that they can produce inexpensively. They can come in and, they just pump their ties out as concrete and just pam, 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 right? Lay them down. They've had enormous railroad growth within China itself. And of course, that's their whole Belt and Road thing. Thing is, China was trying to run south of Russia because it did not. Now, it, of course, has spurs that go to, and it has cooperation with Russia. In the past, Russia was being kind of off to one side about all of that because they don't want the Chinese to build an overland route from the Pacific all the way over to Europe, or, a sea that allows access to Europe, because that cuts away their big brand strength, right? Which is that they run from one end to the other themselves, right? However, they've been pushed up against China in some respects. So, if we're just here speculating, and that's what I usually do. So, your mileage may vary. All people watching, I love to speculate. It's actually what makes this interesting for me. So I'm constantly going out on a limb, trying to see what can be seen with that completion function to figure out the shape of the animal half hidden by the leaves. Because otherwise it's just boring, and you can listen to conventional analysts to figure out their thoughts on it. To me, I think one other possibility, this idea of a nutcracker, which, it doesn't take a Nostradamus to see that Europe is about to have the shit knocked out of it. However, I think there might be some things going on with Russia and the United States where this could all be turned very, very quickly. Again, my old friend Tim, he used to say, if somebody reaches for you to attack you, they've given you a handle. And I said, what's the best way to describe fighting, Tim? And he said, it's a dance where the other guy thinks he's going to lead. So in some respects, I think I can glimpse here the possibility, and I was trying to think of a good metaphor to explain it, and one has not yet occurred to me. Maybe somebody will give it to me in a chat. Some animal that creates circumstances that harm it, but that it can tolerate, because those same circumstances that will wound it will kill its enemies. We're about to see, I mean, the way in which global economies are integrated. We're watching as, I think, a bifurcation is forming, right? So that's why I called it Cold War 2.0. I'm not the first one to say that, not certainly the first person to make this observation that this could be happening. But we're not there yet. And the vestigial integration in terms of logistics and supply chains and energy needs and everything else, and, you know, outstanding debts and bonds and loans and banking practices, everything hasn't been split yet, which means if Europe gets the shit smashed out of it, and the US is not doing well either, and Russia, though it's doing much better than many people expected, and seems to be doing all right, right? They don't seem like they're about to fall on their face at this point. We could be seeing, as a part of this nutcracker gambit, if indeed there were people higher up in the background who were capable, and surely they would be, of planning beyond the scope, planning beyond the time horizon that these knuckle dragging slobberers generally operate with, which is their 3 to 5 year exit strategy, right? People who can actually see the long game, which is the great game. If there are those people in the background, in addition to the nutcracker situation that would smash Europe, you could also see the US take damage, Russia take damage. But what happens to everyone else? It could be like, okay, let's all go into the furnace together, and the rest of you are going to melt, whereas a couple of countries, though battered, will remain standing, and afterwards the entire world is theirs because everybody's had the shit smashed out of them. And so I think it's at least possible that China could fold, could be smashed to pieces. Tim always talked about how they were a paper tiger. They do not have the strength, you know, that everyone thinks they do. Europe and China could end up truly screwed out of this. And that's not to say that the United States would not feel it and that Russia wouldn't feel it. But you might have a situation afterwards where you divided things up into 2 zones. So each person gets their biscuits. Each of the 2 parties that would survive would have some food on the table as a reward for their planning and their cunning. Countries like China would be on the hook to buy energy from someone. Well, they've just been driven closer to Russia, right? If the economic catastrophe is sufficient to cause China to break apart, it certainly seems like it's sufficient to cause the EU to break apart. At least that's conceivable. That's within the realm of possibility. And yet everybody I've listened to, and it seems that way when I look at it with my own eyes, it seems to me that, yeah, US is going to be smashed, but they're not going to get it as bad as Europe. And frankly, the UK is going to be a little better off because they're not in the EU anymore. So you may very well see, to wrap, so I allow you to jump in, you may well see that this whole thing of driving Russia into the arms of China is actually driving China into the arms of Russia. And that if a catastrophic scenario eventuates, these other countries fall to pieces, and damaged but still standing, you have Russia and the United States, and all the initial moves that Russia made to form a bloc with India and China and the US over here. Each person gets their little piece. They still control the northern hemisphere taken as a whole, Russia and the US. You got the Arctic there as a little white monkey intermarium, right? Or a white monkey central Nordic Sea, you know, if the ice changes or whatever. It could be an interesting scene, at least something to chew on among the wilder forms of speculation.
Right. Now, as far as creating a crisis to cause a collapse situation, I do think that's what the West is doing, but I think their goal is to collapse the Russian Federation. The problem I see, though, is that, yeah, Russia and China or sorry, the European Union and China are precarious in many regards. Though I do think Xi's control grid is actually pretty effective. I mean, he's pretty much locked down the Uyghur population out in Western China pretty much effectively. Um, I think Russia's more at risk than China of breaking up. And I also think the United States is not doing great. Not to make this all about U.S. domestic policy, but with the recent Roe decision, the recent Second Amendment decision, the threats that Clarence Thomas made of overturning other court cases, the United States is at a boiling point. The United States is at a knife's edge. The sort of vibes that I'm getting is like Russia in 1905. It's like we had a revolution, we lost to Japan. Why don't we just do the stupidest thing possible and attack Germany? Because what could possibly go wrong? Well, then they lose World War I and have a Russian Revolution at home. I kind of see that the United States is approaching a level of division that's analogous to what Russia was dealing with right before World War One, when it went to war and lost, and those divisions bubbled up and then brought Russia down. So I think, to be honest, if any one of it's going to be like they're all connected economically. So I think if one nation goes down, it's going to be like pulling that string out of a coat, and you keep on pulling it, and then the whole coat disappears because you pulled all the string out.
But Russia's got enormous energy resources of its own, so it's not going to go cold in the winter. That we know.
Well, Russia has enormous energy reserves of its own, but what Russia doesn't have is population reserves.
Fewer people to feed.
Well, no, but what I'm saying is Russia's population, if we look at the rates of decline of population, so there's the TFR rate. Russia has one of the lowest TFRs of any countries on Earth. And that I think is going to put Russia in. So Europe has low TFRs too. I'm not saying they're doing great either. But I think that's going to really cause Russia to break down, because if they fall below a certain level of manpower threshold, they cannot defend their strategic territories.
But is there anything to indicate to you that at present or within a 5-year window that Russia is going to lack human beings to pull levers and do the shit it needs to do?
Well, not in the next 5 years, but if they get involved in a war of attrition in Eastern Europe, where they're grinding through millions of people, it could turn into something like World War I, where the army mutinies.
Yeah, absolutely. There's all kinds of things that could happen there, and I'll agree. And if you extend it, and you're thinking that way, I wasn't, and I see now your point. Yes, if it goes that far, sure. But as it stands now, yeah, declining population, it's been observed many times. I tend to agree. It's a real issue for them. They don't want countries with a surplus population and traditions of exporting that surplus population as a weapon, like China, to just begin to populate all kinds of border regions. The thing is that they still have nuclear weapons. They still have a capable military. They still have capable tech. And I don't see them not being able to pull levers for the next 5 years. I tend to think, could be wildly wrong, this is just a guess, but it's at least possible that Ukraine really will be settled by winter. Now, that doesn't mean that the borders will be fixed and everybody will be happy and they'll just be, kicking back, doing shots with each other. But the major fighting could well be over by winter, and you could just be looking at another frozen conflict where Russia, where the western portion of Ukraine is not doing very well and becomes even more of a drain on Europe. I mean, think about the billions we're all pouring into it right now. Extra billions that we don't have. We keep printing them, but I mean, we're past the point where we're now talking about the inflation that'll come later after we print. It's happening right now. So you could see a situation where Russia settles things fairly quickly in the Ukraine. The western part of the Ukraine is screwed, becomes even more of a drag that precipitates further economic decline in Europe. And Russia just gets to wait it out while we see a year or two of just everything going to hell. So, yeah, on the one hand, you have the kind of scenario you're talking about where it's the grand view, and we might be talking in a generation or two out. But in this immediate framework, let's just call it 3 years. You could easily see Europe crash and Russia do fairly well with it.
I think China would do fairly well in the next 3 years as well.
But what do they do for their raw materials? And what do they do for the markets to sell to? Because Europe is a major market for them, as is the U.S.
So for energy resources and raw materials, Russia's triangulating to China and Asian markets. They're already building a pipeline from Russia to China to help facilitate the transfer of those resources. Now, this has been the big debate of economists about China. Is the Chinese domestic market large enough to absorb its own production? Have enough people in the coastal regions move to the middle class to do so? If they have, then that means China's okay. The United States passed through that phase sometime after World War II. And if they can't, well, then that's a different question altogether. And the way China controls and manipulates its economics data, it's going to be hard to tell.
But you see
Now,
how that would put them on, they would be on the Russian tit at that point.
yeah, no, yeah, they would, Russia and them would be close together, and
Well,
Russia would.
but not just Russia would be in the dominant position, while everyone right now is talking about how this forces Russia to have to go to China hat in hand to ask for these things. And Russia is increasingly dependent on China. But you see, if you play the turnabout game,
Mhm.
and suddenly the export markets that they previously enjoyed, like the United States and Russia, are struggling so hard. Their arguments, I'm not an economist, maybe they do really well in the US because they could produce something cheaper, but when you start to think about the transit costs and the rest and the energy prices, I don't know. So if China is struck simultaneously by the loss of the US partially and Europe partially because as export markets because of the problems there, and they increasingly have to buy their raw materials, not just their energy, but the raw materials and their energy from Russia, then suddenly all their money's flowing to Russia, and Russia's got steady business, and China's struggling. I don't believe, for my part, could be wrong, I've only been to China once, but from everything I've seen and heard, once you get into the interior, and I'm sure you're aware of this, as you pointed out, coastal cities, you're dealing with like early Iron Age shit in large part. I mean, and they still use human feces as fertilizer. They have real problems. They've also been hit over and over again with flooding. And they got the Quad they're playing games with. Japan is there too, and South Korea is still present. There are tensions and pressures there. All kinds of things could happen, but I do not think it's impossible that China could basically catch the hammer with their face and find themselves in a position where it looked like Russia was going to be dependent upon them, and it got turned about. But go on, please.
Yeah. Now, this is not going to happen within the next 3 years, but I think the really interesting thing to look forward here is the big, great game move that I have to think is already being thought out now in Western analysts. We know that in the 80s, the United States was willing to, fund radical Islamist groups in Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union in order to bring it down. Now, one can imagine to do two things: to block China's Belt and Road Initiative and to undermine the Russian Federation. The United States funds Salafi terrorist groups all over Central Asia, Western China, and the portions of Russia that have large Islamic populations. I mean, you could have a massive jihad over that region, which could just boil and bubble for decades.
Now, what sort of jihad now?
So all those regions are Muslim. So I could see a future in which the Western powers decide to arm and fund these people to engage in a jihad against Russia and China. So for example, in World War One, that was one of Germany's goals, was to incite through the Ottoman Empire, their ally,
Right.
a
That's why
jihad.
Enver Pasha, one of the Young Turks, went rolling up into Central Asia, but he disappeared
Exactly.
into obscurity, and it never happened because those groups are very much more divided than many people think. I saw somebody mention Sogdians there early on. You've got Shiites, you've got Iranic language speaking groups, which you can see in Afghanistan and Turkmenistan, Tajikistan especially. That said, my old buddy Tim also seemed to think that there was going to be the rise, as he said somewhat wryly, of some great prophetic figure in Central Asia, which might suggest pulling a lever on just that sort of thing. But I'm not so sure that it would work as well in Russia because they have a much longer standing relationship with Muslims, much longer standing. And those people have a considerable amount of social mobility, and they've got the myth of the partial myth. There's some degree of truth to the idea that they have, that Kazakhstan is an independent country. It's not entirely true. It's still attached to Russia, and they still have their security agreements, as we saw with the weirdness in Kazakhstan recently and the rapid reaction force used for the first time from Russia for these, their version of the European Union. But I'm not so sure that part would fold. I shouldn't say fold. I'm not so sure that they would get as much traction with trying to push the Muslims after the Russians, though it might vary from place to place. It's not one picture, as I'm sure you know. But they certainly could have some. They could do things in, Kashgaria, Xinjiang. Yeah, for sure.
Also, Grozny, where the Chechens are.
Yeah, except
So,
they're run by right now. I mean, Kadyrov has his. I mean, they have their own strongman there,
well,
and
they
they
do at the moment, yes. So what would have to happen is a coup or an assassination attempt for that to change, because there are still Chechens fighting him. The way Putin won the Second Chechen War was he basically found a Chechen warlord to be his man on the throne, and he gave him, I'll write checks for you and just keep Chechnya in line. Now, one could envision a future where that's not possible. I mean, at the darkest days, there was the bombing of Moscow in 2004 by Chechen terrorists. So we see what radical Islam, how far its reach can be in Russia if it's fully mobilized. Now, in 2004, we were busy. The United States was busy fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Russia was not really on the U.S. radar. So funding Chechen separatists and terrorists was not really in the playbook at the time. But given how we funded the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets, I think it's conceivable that we'd fund the Uyghurs to fight the Chinese. We'd fund Chechens to fight the Russians, and depending on if we could have an Islamic prophet or an Islamic leader sort of galvanize that part of the world. Because from the U.S. perspective, it would stop the Belt and Road Initiative through Kazakhstan, and it would facilitate the breakup of the Russian Federation. And that's a game that Germany tried to play in World War One. It's a game that we played in the Cold War. So I think it's a move that's on the table for the Great Game. Whether the U.S. will do it is another question, but I think we shouldn't rule that out.
Indeed, and whether or not it'll be successful is a separate question. So yeah, they could also, if they do it, that we're not necessarily saying they'd be successful because, of course, in the long game, even with Afghanistan and the rest, Russia's still there. It's just changed its form. My buddy Tim was of the opinion that Russia pretended to fold in order to invite investment. His big metaphor is he's like, be pulling back to the Urals and, allowing the enemy to come in and be swallowed by the vast distances that they couldn't even get their heads around before they actually got troops there. These kinds of things. He said they just did it economically. They pulled back, allowed massive Western investment. They've gotten up to speed with the technology in large part. They're far better than they were, for example, in the mid 80s, trying to keep up with what was going on in the West, and we're being left far behind. They've now got hypersonic missiles. They got new tanks they've developed. They're plugging in new submarines. They're partnering, like I said, on the BrahMos missiles with groups in India. And the other thing is, I don't think that you're going to see Chechnya or the Caucasus there. I just don't see them. I mean, it's possible that somebody could get, that the West or some player could stand up forces that would cause them some problems, but I don't think they're going to get caught twice with their pants down in the Caucasus. It's just not going to happen. The other thing you have to remember, in my view, with respect, the other thing you have to remember is that all these Chechens are fighting in Ukraine right now, and they come with Kadyrov. They know how they're paid. They know how it works. They're with a successful warlord. He gives them gold rings for their arms. They are his thanes, right? That it's, to screw up a bunch of mixed metaphors. But the idea is that they know what side their bread is buttered on. And now increasingly, they've been rotating those troops through. So you don't just have a bunch of Chechens who like to watch UFC and, practice kickboxing in their spare time and wrestling all day long, every day, literally. They're also now, they've been cycled in and out of modern warfare in Ukraine. So they've got a polished fighting force there that knows how the gibs flow to them, and they're not going to want to threaten that. I would think. Okay, but this is these are I can't blame you for drawing this far afield because I always do it. So I apologize for that. We're coming up on 2 hours now. We don't have to close exactly on that, but before I look at it and maybe just recap the things that I think are likely to happen, or at least the places that we should all be looking at to see what will come next. Maybe I can throw the map up for you and you can sort of summarize your view on what's likely to happen here. And, go over it one more time and let everybody know what you think the future holds, and I'll do the same. And then after that, shilling, and we can wrap.
That sounds great.
All right. Well, here, whoops. Let me get this sorted and close my notes. So it's my old version. I could just share the damn window rather than having to do the whole screen. Okay. Let me plug this up just so we can all see the map here. So Praise of Folly, thank you, sir. Just to summarize, what do you think we should be looking at? What's likely to happen next?
Yeah. So I think, so to agree with what you said, I think a holding position in the Caucasus will remain. Russia has the objectives that it wants. Unless we have, some outside forces that haven't acted yet, like maybe Turkey, yeah, that's probably not going to change too much. I think that Russia's goal in the Ukraine, I think, is likely going to be this: to control all the territory up to the Dnieper River, which cuts Ukraine more or less in half, and then controlling the Black Sea coast, the Black Sea coast that leads up to Odessa and Transnistria, and then reducing Western Ukraine to a Rome state. Um, whether they actually want to invade the Baltic states, I don't know yet. But what they are going to do, and I think we can foresee them doing, is lots of cyber attacks. And they're also probably going to leverage the Russian population in those regions to put pressure on the governments to destabilize them in conjunction with cyber attacks. Now, again, with Bulgaria, it depends on what some of these pro-Russian parties do. If we, if a coalition government can form around the Bulgarian Socialist Party, that would be bad for NATO because they would probably want to have closer ties with Russia. But of course, NATO is going to want to prevent that from happening. So Bulgaria, and again, most of the NATO EU is not happy with Bulgaria's position on North Macedonia. Almost everybody views it as an embarrassment. So it depends on if Bulgaria is intransigent on that issue, it might lead to a more pro-Russian drift anyhow, because I don't see, at least in the immediate future, Bulgaria backing down from that. Europe, has till the winter before the crunch is on, and will Putin be able to use the heavy rod of Russian gas and oil to break Europe and say, look, weaken your connections to the United States. Maybe even for him, the ultimate goal, I think, is to break up NATO. And I think, now again, that would be his perfect, Christmas wish list. I don't think he's going to get that much, and not his full wish list, but the gains he wants to make, ideally in Europe, going, up to the, dropping a line from Gdansk down to the Carpathians and controlling the Romanian corridor between the Carpathians and the Black Sea, could only be achieved if NATO breaks up. So if that's the ultimate end game, and he knows he may not get that, but if that's the ultimate end game, then I think he wants to break NATO up, and he's going to use energy as the way to do it. And Europe shot itself in the foot. Like soon as fall and winter come, they're screwed. Like they're not going to be able to find alternative energy sources. And also, this is on the tail of Europe having all of this green energy initiative. Like Germany was, we're going to be the most greenest, Denmark, Germany, but that didn't work. In fact, the deactivating of nuclear power plants was a part of the green arsenal, the green agenda, and now Germany's just screwed. So I think Europe is going to have this winter. I think will decide the next 5 years how Europe handles this.
I agree with that in large part. I think I don't think they need to invade the Baltics. I think that if they punch NATO in the nose via Ukraine in such a fashion that their standing is that their reputation, they have a serious loss of face, then they don't need to do that with the Baltics. There will be tension there and concern in those countries. Again, we're only talking about 6 or 7 million people, and he's already talked about putting his intermediate range missiles in Belarus, which is right across that whole the corridor, right, running down between Belarus and Kaliningrad. So I mean, nukes are coming back into this story, and I was around for that. I was alive for it. I had the drills in high school, where you had to crawl up under the desk. I was there as a kid when when I guess it was Threads in Britain and the day after came out in the United States. There's a whole side to this about nuclear war that can shut all of this down. I think a large part of what we're seeing is there are a bunch of young people who did not come up in that period when the threat of that was a major thing. And once it comes back on the table, and that can be turned on as a message and a narrative that can lock everything down, can freeze it. So yeah, I don't think that they're going to go after the Baltics. I think that they're going to dump money into the Baltics because they got plenty of it right now, and the EU and NATO have less of it than they did. I mean, so I think they're going to destabilize them and do all kinds of things short of kinetic warfare to express their displeasure gently to the Baltics. And I think we're going to see the nuclear posturing ramp up. I think it's a better than 50-50 even chance that Moldova is going to experience some upheaval. I think it is most likely that they're going to cut across to Odessa and connect with Transnistria. I think their goal is to cut off Ukraine entirely from the Black Sea. As you pointed out with Crimea, it's already kind of a, it doesn't matter as much because they have that naval control, but with NATO right there too, I think they need to take that coastline and completely isolate Western Ukraine into a rump state, at which point they can use their leverage in the east of what used to be Ukraine, along with Abkhazia and their inroads into Georgia and the rest, Turkey being a wild card there, as you pointed out. I think they're going to connect Transnistria. They're going to cut off the groups they don't like in Ukraine from the Black Sea entirely, or try. And then looking at it, Hungary is playing a very, very careful game because Orban is a sophisticated player, but they're a small country. They're not super powerful. However, they can't take Orban out yet. He's playing a very sophisticated game. And if you just look at the map, you can see that if they can destabilize Bulgaria and Moldova and render Western Ukraine an afterthought that doesn't even really matter that much, and they've got Hungary and Serbia, and if Serbia and Bulgaria do something along the lines of agreeing to split North Macedonia, which isn't even a country anyway. I mean, I'm not saying that. I'm saying from their perspective, right? I mean, when I was in Greece the first time in 91-ish, right, there was spray paint graffiti everywhere that said Macedonia is Greece, because the Greeks were like, fuck you, this isn't Macedonia, what? And then the Macedonia, they're now saying, what's this North Macedonia thing, right? Like everybody's like, where did this country come from, right? And you pointed out that, and everybody knows that the Balkans is like a gas-soaked rag, Don't go, chipping your flint next to it. But the point is that with Moldova, a defanged Ukraine, Hungary, and Serbia, and maybe North Macedonia too, you have Romania entirely surrounded. And if they're entirely surrounded, they can be contained to some extent. And they can certainly be subverted and manipulated to some extent. And like you talked about, if the EU basically tumbles teeth first towards the curb economically in this immediate window that's coming up, it could be very interesting indeed. The other thing is that Turkey's not really stable. And depending on which way Erdogan might want to go, if they're economically unstable and Russia's really pissed off and wants to give them, kind of like pull the pin out and say, here, hold this, they could experience real trouble, because we're not done with the stuff in Syria and the Kurds. Remember, Russia is down there on the other side. They're north of Turkey and south of them now. So yeah, I would say look at the Baltics. I expect to see Russia get in there and just wreak havoc in all kinds of ways that aren't kinetic, that are economic and propaganda, and and like you were talking about, things where they're playing games with cyber warfare and the rest. Ukraine, I expect that they're going to try to cut off Ukraine entirely from the sea and move towards Transnistria. Bulgaria, we're going to have to wait and see. But I imagine, if I had to guess, I'm not a betting man, but if I had to guess and bet, I would bet on the idea that Russian intelligence services are enormously busy in Bulgaria right now, hugely busy. Romania, I just don't have a clear enough sense with them. But yeah, that's my take on it. Not to deprive you of any last word. I would turn it over to you now. And if there is anything else that you want to cover or that came up, throw it in. And then please tell people again about your channel and where they can find you. Hopefully you guys will all go and check it out and consider subscribing.
Right. So I guess I think the first thing I'll say is like the ancient Chinese proverb, "May you live in interesting times," which is actually a curse. That's sort of what we're living through now. I think really when we look at the forces arrayed against each other globally, so the Russia-China axis versus the sort of Atlantis axis. On the one hand, we saw with the way that they handled the coup and had people shelter in place, they can be extremely authoritarian and extremely effective at controlling large populations in the West. Now, we know China is very effective at controlling populations, and we know Russia is as well. It depends on, how what I think is going to happen, and we won't know it until it happens. There's the things that we can all see. So the exoteric information, the exoteric truths. But there's these hidden things, the esoteric things that are deep in the bowels of the State Department, deep in the bowels of the, FSB, deep in the bowels of the Chinese Communist Party, that are really going to be the key pivots for all of this. But we just won't know because we're not privy to all these state secrets. And the real fracture points and pivot points are going to be things that we don't know. It's what Donald Rumsfeld called an unknown unknown. We don't even know we don't know them. But once this conflict grinds itself out, however how many years it takes, I think we will realize that those things that we didn't even see coming were these stress points and fractures deep inside these organizations that would later be decisive for whoever wins this conflict. You could also again find me in the YouTube search bar. You can type in Praise of Folly podcast. You can find my locals at praiseoffollylocals.com. You can find me at Twitter at POF podcast. And I just want to thank you again, Semyogog. It was a great conversation. I love talking about geopolitics, and yeah, it's great.
Well, thanks very, very much for coming on. And thanks to everyone who joined us for this. As promised, I'm trying to get back into geopolitics. So this, I think, is the second or third shot out of the box in that regard. I hope to have many more of them in the future. Let me just take a quick look and see what I have coming up so I can run it by you guys. I should have had this set up already. Excuse the boomer aspect. Do I have anything coming up next? I am speaking with Apostolic Majesty about nationalism and Turkish irredentism. Basically, a political situation vis-a-vis Turkish nationalism, its history, and things that are going on in the present as well. I think we're going to dip into some things about like their linguistic reforms and some other things from that period of Turkish nationalism. We'll probably talk a bit about the MHP, the Turkish Nationalist Party there, and some other things that's going to be coming up on Friday, the 8th. And other than that, I have a few possible things planned, but they haven't been locked in. I want to do something with Pharaoh here shortly, and that will likely be on the art of spiritualism. I'm hoping in the next little bit here to get Conscious Caracol on again. He has just now submitted, and I think it'll be released soon, paper on some interesting things going on in South Africa. So I hope to have him on so he can talk about it as well. Please do check that out. Other things are in the works, but they have not yet taken form. They are amorphous out there in the ether, waiting to take shape. So, ladies and gentlemen, please do follow me over on Twitter. Please do follow me on Telegram and over on Odyssey, maybe on BitChute too. As always, thank you all very much for being here. And again, thanks to Praise of Folly as a guest. That's all for now. I'm Semyogog, and I am out.